Hello and welcome back to The Current. Is a more consumer-led approach to energy the best answer for industrial businesses that are managing competing demands such as cost, security and sustainability? This is an issue Caroline Bragg is keen to speak more on. As CEO of the Association for Decentralised Energy, she seeks a reimagined energy market in which businesses can choose when they generate and consume electricity. If realised at scale, this flexibility will deliver major advantages for both generation and demand. Lower energy bills, reduced emissions, site stability, and a more resilient grid network capable of integrating more renewables. With policy, technology, and the market now aligning, the shift away from a wholly centralised energy system is beginning to gather pace. But for industrial sites, flexibility remains a challenge, not least because of the costs associated with this transition. So what's needed to push this agenda forward, and how can businesses reap the rewards of on-site generation in the meantime? For this episode, Caroline is joined by James Blunt, Head of Carbon at Aggreko. As part of a team delivering energy projects across Europe, James offers an on-the-ground look at the flexibility challenge for today's high-energy users. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, James and Caroline offer a much-needed joined-up look at what's really needed for businesses to become truly grid interactive. James, Caroline, welcome to The Current.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good stuff. Okay, I'd just like to sort of really kick off with your roles and responsibilities, Caroline, at the ADE. So you can just give us an overview of the organisation and the work you do.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Chief Executive of ADE. So we have two main things. It's the reason why we exist. We have ADE Heat Networks, which is all about heat decarbonisation through networks. And then we have ADE Demand. ADE Demand, as you say, is nothing less than reimagining how our energy system is going to be. When we have a world where actually you put in renewables and they are weather dependent, what you need to start thinking about is the role of demand. So particularly industrial sites, but also domestic households and businesses, and the way in which they need to decarbonise in a way that works for them, and where they do so through electrification, how they can use that flexibility to lower their own bills and keep the lights on.
What's the sort of long-term vision, I guess, for the ADE?
For ADE Demand in particular, what we really need is a huge increase in flexibility in the UK. You know, it's really sort of waxed and waned over the last 5 to 10 years. Obviously, we had triads. That was a real kind of boon to industrial flex. With network charging reforms, that's now gone away. Mm-hmm. But with this new government, the talk is good, right? Mm-hmm. But the delivery, a little bit less so at the minute. And when we're facing, you know, if you look, for example, at the recent select committee with all of the energy supplier chief execs, we are going into a world where the non-commodity costs for industrial users, so network charging, the costs that they pay for the policy that we're employing, particularly around renewables and other costs, all of that is spiralling in a way that's actually really, really difficult to manage for industrial users. And flexibility is one of the ways in which we help bring bills down.
Yeah, well, we're going to come on to that in a bit more detail later on. But just, I guess, more personally, I suppose, what interests you most about industrial flexibility?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I feel like one of the things about the energy system is just how naff it is. You know, when you actually look at, you know, there's corners of the energy system where you just say, really, is this the best that we can possibly do? You know, and I think one of the great things about industrial flexibility is we are sitting on this gold mine that we could use, that works for industrials to manage their costs. You know, we all know that we need to improve industrial productivity to improve economic growth in this country, and energy bills is a fundamental part of that. Yeah. But more than that, this is something that we have already. We don't have to build new things. You know, it's not the same. It's not the same side of that at all. What we actually need to do is just be able to harness it in a way that works.
Yeah, there's a really interesting a piece of research from, I think it's Imperial, where they said a lot of the technology required for the energy transition already exists, just in varying degrees of maturity. I always remember that. I always think that's a great line. Exactly. That really touches on what
it's not about silver bullets.
Yes.
It's about being much smarter and more elegant.
Exactly, yeah. James, what about you at Aggreko?
At Aggreko, I'm Head of Carbon is my title. So I work in the sustainability team. And I work on lots of different areas of the business, decarbonisation strategy, talking to the supply chain about sustainable supply and how we bring that in and organise that and collaborate with the suppliers that we work with. I also, with my background in carbon, I look at carbon credits as an alternative to decarbonisation. Renewable energy certificates is another area I'm involved in. But I think what's really interesting at the moment with the way the business is going is we've seen that our customers are becoming much more aware and in need of support from a sustainability standpoint. And so actually the sustainability team has become much more involved in the commercial side of the business. So we're now engaging much more alongside salespeople with sustainability heads in the organisations and the customers that we work with. So it's been it's a fairly varied role. We've done a lot of work in areas like hybridisation, for example, where you're taking different technologies, bringing them together and creating a solution that works more effectively for customers. We have a initiative called Greener Upgrades, which is a fantastic way of explaining to customers and helping customers unwrap and unlock the various options that they have when decarbonising their business. So, the traditional solution of an overspec'd or an oversized generator is not necessarily the way forward. There are lots of other solutions you can offer. So these are solutions and services that we offer in the wider sales process. But I mean, also, as I was saying, in terms of integrating more with the commercial teams and the sales teams now, many of our customers actually have a need to and an obligation to decarbonise. And I think that means that if we can sit alongside our commercial teams and talk collaboratively with our customers and their sustainability leads, it's a real benefit for the business.
Yeah. Just similarly as well, just a sort of more personal outlook on this issue that we're discussing today. What is it that interests you about it in particular?
I mean, I think, traditionally we had a centralised grid system, and the centralised grid system with lots of coal-fired power stations running across the Midlands, providing power to the nation. That's not the way we're going, and we're clearly going in a very different direction now. And there's huge opportunity to develop power generation on site, which is something that is being utilised to some degree, but I think, as to Caroline's point, it could go a lot further. This is one of the things that Aggreko works very hard on, is to ensure that the services we give to our customers are aligned to their needs, but also, a lot of the work we do is behind the meter type solutions, where i.e. close to the location of the power consumption rather than coming through the grid.
Caroline, I'd like to just get a little bit more about what is meant by flexibility, I suppose, from the ADE's perspective.
Yeah,
in particular. I know you've touched on it briefly in the introduction there, but can you just give us a rundown of what it actually means to you?
Yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, this is not a layman-friendly word, right? I feel like in the energy sector, we often talk in code, and we should probably do better. All flexibility means is that, particularly in the case of industrial sites, you're effectively moving, particularly your power needs, up or down in response to a signal. And that signal might be, for example, what the network is telling you, so what you're paying in network charges over the day, for example. It might be because you're part of a market, like something like the capacity market, which helps us keep the lights on. Or it might be that actually the markets where we trade electricity, called the wholesale markets, those are showing you a signal that says actually you can get some really cheap power at the minute, or power is going to be more expensive later on in the day. So all it means is that you're responding to those types of signals.
Right, okay. James, does that description align with your...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about options, really, isn't it? It's about giving companies the option to be as efficient, both in their power consumption, but also in the cost of that power in question. So if there's an opportunity to generate on site and consume from on site or near site, then why not do that? I mean, ultimately, the more you consume on or near site, the less you're actually dragging out of the main grid, and the main grid is pretty constrained already. So the less force and pressure you apply to the main grid, I think the better. So yeah, flexibility is about options, really, in my humble opinion. Yeah.
It's quite nice, actually, I guess, because you're talking about these schemes or these opportunities, and I guess the other side of that equation is participation. Having the ability to participate means you obviously have to have a degree of on-site flexibility as well. And that's obviously where Aggreko comes in here.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, as we move forward, it's just going to get more and more, right, to your point in terms of, as we see industrial sites wanting to decarbonise, a lot of what we talk about with companies and investors is, they're looking at options around, for example, electrification, around kind of partial use of biomethane, for example. But all of that, the only way you're going to get that to stack up is through a lot of on-site use and flexibility. It certainly doesn't stack up right now.
Yeah, I think, it's something that we at Aggreko have invested a lot of money is providing the optionality for the customer. So, we don't go in with a one-size-fits-all solution. We talk to the customer, we understand what the customer's needs are, and then we try and balance that with a toolkit, if you like, of various solutions that we can provide. So it's about aligning what the customer needs and with the solutions that we can make available to them.
Sure. So I just want to move on to a bit about strategy. Caroline, you've spoken a lot about flexibility as a strategic asset. I've done some background research ahead of this recording, so forgive me. But for industrial customers navigating the energy transition, how can they manage associated costs and challenges, especially where flexibility isn't an option?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of a diverse range of options. I mean, none of them are good enough at the minute. Let's just be 100% sort of clear on that. I think our energy system needs a radical overhaul so that, the work that, say, James does is actually something that the energy system is really encouraging in a way that we've not seen before. I mean, what we see from others particularly, I mean, kind of incremental improvements in energy efficiency remains an important part, right? Maximising self-consumption remains an important part. Yeah. Managing where you can, your process kind of power input is also important. We'll have to see where things go in terms of more broadly, and perhaps to your point, James, there are changes perhaps to how carbon accounting is going to develop over the next few years, which is something that we need to keep a look, to keep a watch over. Sure. And then I think more generally, where we are at the minute, it's so important that efficient CHP, kind of using both power and heat, where that's the right thing for those industrial sites, is still a really important part of the mix, right? Yes. Before we're in a situation where lots of industrial sites are able to decarbonise.
Curious to get your take on PPAs in particular. I know this option, I suppose, is quite helpful for industrial sites having to balance cost, reliability, security and sustainability, those sort of four biggies, I suppose. Yeah. Is that something you see as like a viable model, I suppose, for this equation?
I think it depends on what you're trying to do. I think, obviously if sustainability is a very strong driver, corporate PPAs, green PPAs have been a really important part of that mix. And with the recent, particularly with government's focus on onshore wind, what we're probably likely to see is that becomes an even more important part of the market. But I would say, I think, compared to what we see perhaps internationally, corporate PPAs as a route to sustainability have not been as strong in this country as others. And in some respects, government also hasn't probably given them the focus that they should have done.
Do you expect that to change, given what you know about the policies landscape, I suppose?
We'll have to see. I mean, there are sort of recommendations, for example, from government at the minute that look at the National Wealth Fund, which is the kind of state bank, as it were, that are looking at them at whether they could, for example, provide guarantees or other ways in which we can effectively pool the creditworthiness of industrial sites to support the corporate PPA market. Right. And that might be quite interesting. We're seeing lots of onshore wind coming off of subsidy going into its kind of merchant tail, and you'd expect that to also drive a bit of activity there. But I think if we're still in a world where CFDs and subsidy are the real driver of renewable investment in this country, I think it's always going to be a little bit difficult. Yeah, so it's really a case of a balance then, as we've sort of alluded to. Okay. James, just I guess more on the technology side of things, what are some really promising technologies that Aggreko are sort of deploying to give customers more flexibility?
I think one of the big game changers for us has been hybridization is a key area. So bringing the technologies together is very important. I think another area that we're very focused on at Aggreko is the actual physical monitoring of our equipment, the gathering of that data, the analysis of that data, and then the use of that data, both for our own reporting purposes, but also for our customers. So the customers have access to the data, and it's a very valuable tool for them as they become more responsible for their actions. It's important that we give them the information that they need to, need to be able to impart that information to other parties.
Yeah, I guess the key, obviously, that's the other side of flexibility, isn't it? I guess when you're generating on site is, yes, the technology is there, but it's also being able to use it in the best possible way. Yeah. Obviously, there's an efficiency question here hanging over everything. you need to know how to use that equipment at the right times, the right profiles, the right loads in order to get the most out of it. So, yeah, it's an interesting point. I know we've touched on reform and policy to some degree, Caroline. Could you just give us a bit more on that? So, what's most urgently needed to unlock flexibility at scale?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, so much. But the thing I would say most, I think, is flexibility has been, in some respects, the sort of motherhood and apple pie of the energy system for about 10 to 15 years. You know, it is clearly a good idea. But what we have failed to see, I think, over that time and over a number of big strategies announcing how much we're going to do on flexibility is real delivery on the ground.
Yes.
And that making the changes to markets, to governance, to data requirements that we actually need. So the one thing, I think, that is super important over the next 5 years is government leadership to knock heads together and actually make some changes so that industrial sites can crack on.
Yeah. When you say on the ground there, can you just give a bit more to that? What's actually behind that phrase?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we tend to see is sort of very highfalutin statements of how wonderful flexibility is and how much we're going to have. But what doesn't happen is, you know, in the trenches, the changes to, for example, our codes, to market requirements, to our data requirements, those things don't tend to happen. And they don't happen in a strategic, coordinated way that actually brings volumes through. I'll take an example, right? So we have been working with NESO to try to get EVs into the balancing mechanism, right? So to support, basically, when we have too much energy or we have energy in the wrong place, particularly wind at the minute, as has been in the news, what you want to be able to do is NESO wants to be able to turn that wind off and turn something else up to manage the system so the wires don't melt. Basically, it would be great and complete no regrets if we were using EVs to do that. You know, it means that you're not creating higher emissions than you would otherwise, and it means that people are getting much lower energy bills for charging their cars. All to the good. Yes. It has taken so long to get to a situation where EVs can get into that balancing mechanism in a straightforward way.
Yes.
And that's just one of many examples where there are unnecessary blockers to doing this properly.
Yes, I get that delay aspect, I suppose, or the glacial pace of change, I guess, that we're alluding to. I guess that's where companies like Aggreko really can support customers, because there is obviously that base need that needs to be addressed in the meantime. So it's just curious to get that reference, I suppose, that you're saying it's a slow pace, I guess.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, it must accelerate. But I think the wonderful thing about particularly on-site generation and hybridization, as James was talking about, particularly where you're kind of using, for example, batteries alongside renewables, alongside backup, you can play all sorts of games with that in terms of your self-consumption. No regrets at all. And then it's already ready for you, as markets develop as we need them to over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes. Is that something that, you're seeing with customers, I suppose, James?
I think, definitely that, customers, I think there are some things that we should probably point out here. I mean, we pay a lot of money for electricity in the UK, and that's a challenge. And so customers are increasingly looking for ways to be more cost effective. And they also have this increasing legislation and rules around their physical emissions and that sort of thing. So if you take those two together, they're always looking at ways to be more efficient, cleaner, and save money ultimately. So and I think there's a bit of a sea change and a bit of a change in understanding that renewable, sustainable solutions are not necessarily the most expensive solution. They can actually be a really cost-effective solution as well, and do all the positives that come with sustainable power generation. So. Sure. I hope that answers the question.
No, yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, it's good to know. I guess just more curious, actually. Are these conversations something that you see regularly with industrial customers like this? Is the issue of flexibility on the agenda for them? As James has obviously suggested there that customers are looking for different ways to sort of generate and manage their energy. Is that something that you see at a higher level at sort of policy debates and events?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's as I said, I feel there's been a a little bit of a shift, I would say, I guess. I think, say 5-10 years ago, a lot of people were in triads. That was quite an important part of how they did their energy management.
Yes.
And in some respects that it really sort of, it was a very negative thing that came out of, Ofgem's reforms to remove that signal in quite the way that they did. But I think following that, it's really come up the agenda again, I think, when I talk to both industrials as well as government. I mean, government's most recent strategy for flexibility, Clean Flexibility Roadmap, has a specific focus on how we make sure that we're enabling flexibility from industrials.
Yeah.
It's that important to them. And I think for industrials, to your point, I mean, what we're seeing is, some of the most innovative stuff that we're seeing is how you kind of manage your import and export so that you can take advantage of things like, for example, excess wind, or how you can take advantage of some of the other markets that we've got. That's where we're really seeing huge amounts of innovation at the minute, which is really exciting.
Many new or expanding industrial sites are struggling to connect to the grid for a multitude of reasons.
Yeah.
Caroline, why has this become such a bottleneck, and what can businesses do about it?
So I mean, connections has been a real problem, right? I think this has been a 10-year issue in the making, really, if you look at it. We had for a long time a sort of status quo in the energy sector where networks were not allowed to build unless there was clear indication of need, and quite a sort of a very slow process by which we moved people through the queue. I mean, it's really interesting over the course of the last year, right? Because what we've seen is one of the most radical changes to connections I think we've seen in a very long time. NESO has literally torn up the existing queue and said, right, you're only connecting if you're useful to us,
yes,
and you can demonstrate you've got planning, etc., which has been a really radical change. On the other hand, that process has not gone very well, and more than that, I think there's been such an enormous focus on transmission. Actually, I feel often, and this is the way that I describe it to government, I feel there is a hidden queue for industrial sites at the minute where it's not very obvious, in the same way as it is for renewable generation or batteries front of meter, where people are just being put off in terms of the investments that they want to make, electrification, because they have a conversation with their DNO, and the DNO says, well, that's going to cost you a lot of money,
yes,
and it's going to be 10 years before you get something. But all of this is hidden, and we're simply not having the same conversation about the need for strategic infrastructure planning at distribution for industrial sites as we have been, for example, for the generation side at transmission.
Yeah, that waiting time. So we had a conversation on another episode about data centres in particular.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, that's probably the most visible waiting connection issue, I suppose, in the press. I mean, James, that the common solution there for a lot of these clients, as we heard from Billy Jury on the other episode, was bridging solutions. Can you just speak a bit more on what Aggreko does there? So being able to support customers where the grid's not able to.
Yeah, I mean, you have, depending on where you are in the country and depending on the sector you're in, and data centres are a classic example, there is insatiable demand for power these days, and in some sectors it's even more than the norm. And so obviously, local grids, we already know they're quite tight in terms of the spare capacity they have. And so these enormous developments with their huge draw on energy, they create a challenge for the grid. And so Aggreko steps in, and during the construction, the commissioning phase, and then potentially a bridging phase as well, while the grid locally is being reinforced, Aggreko will provide that temporary power solution through traditional gen sets, or we use gas sometimes as well. So, we're providing solutions that basically bridge that period when the grid is not available. I suppose where we're going to as a next level, where we're starting to build solar parks and that sort of thing, we're trying to integrate those into near-site private wire type scenarios where you can actually physically provide them with not just that bridging power, but also that long-term solution. And I think a lot of these companies as well, they're not just, they realise that they will rely on the grid to some extent, but they also like resilience in their business model. So they want alternative sources. It goes back to flexibility is the best word here. We're using it all the time. That's what it's all about. It's about giving companies the options to optimise when they use the power and where it comes from.
Sure. I've just got some standout projects as well, James. Just wanted to get your take on those as well. I think they kind of add a bit more meat to the bones in terms of Aggreko work in this sense. Can you just talk a bit more on that?
We're working with grid companies where we're helping to reinforce the grid temporarily while they physically reinforce the grid for the long term. So, I mean, at the high level, we do that sort of thing. But also, there's a lot of work, as I've already mentioned, in the data centre world. They are complex. They have insatiable demand for power, and it's growing all the time. So we've got to be both as their sector and as a service provider. We've got to be fleet of foot, and we've got to be entrepreneurial here and think of the best and optimal ways to provide their power needs. We're also involved in building solar parks. So one of our solar parks is actually up in Scotland, and that's going to be providing power to customers near to the site. So that's another way of ensuring that the power that we generate from the solar parks we're starting to build will actually be close to the customers who need that power. And I think that's something, PPAs are a very valuable tool, but if you can have that private wire scenario where you bring the customer and the power provision together through a private wire or a near-site solution, even a behind-the-meter solution, you're into really powerful, game-changing initiative. So
powerful is the word here. I mean, I've got it down. It's 20 megawatt, that solar farm. So it's a big project. Caroline, just moving on, I suppose. Current regulation and technological advances. There's obviously a bit of a push-pull scenario here. How is current regulation keeping pace with technological advancement, I suppose, in on-site generation and storage? Is there a gap?
I think there is. I think what we've seen is, particularly when you look on the market side, a lot of our flexibility markets are held by NESO. They're underway in terms of an enormous IT transformation programme within that organisation as they become public. But we're still in a situation where NESO still struggles too much to dispatch smaller assets, that would be the most cost-effective way of balancing our energy system. So we're definitely seeing improvements. They've launched big things like the open balancing platform, etc. But there is some way to go, I would say. And I think the second thing is, that's a sort of a microcosm of a bigger problem, which is that, what we're actually seeing is some of the kind of on-site tech people are kind of putting in, the way in which they're working with companies to operate their assets is still significantly further ahead than the way in which we are digitalising the energy system overall. Silly examples, right? But on the domestic scale, the idea of can we actually figure out what customers have used on a half-hourly basis and then bill them for it, that has taken about 10 years, and we are still going on that journey.
Wow.
And in general, we're starting to get into a situation where digitalisation initiatives actually across government, Ofgem, NESO, Elexon and others, it's quite confused at the minute. I would say that there's good things within that, and that's fine. But we do need, I think, a bit more pace, a bit more clarity. Yeah.
So I guess I kind of brought it up already, but that mismatch, I suppose, in terms of development on the policy side, regulation side, and obviously what's happening on these sites already,
exactly.
obviously speaks to the need for companies like Aggreko being able to support customers with the sort of various challenges they face.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, as we always see, right? Businesses are the ones who are innovating and finding sort of real kind of real solutions to the problems we've got. I think, what I do every day, what my team does every day, is try to get to a point where government is getting out of your way and encouraging something that actually could lower bills overall.
Caroline, I guess, are there interim market mechanisms and incentives that could help businesses monetize flexibility before full participation is possible?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that we should be looking at, I guess, over the next little bit. The first thing, obviously, we have the budget coming up very soon, probably at the end of November, so we're a month away. Yes. One of the changes that we have seen over the last few years, to James's point actually, is a kind of subsidy support, particularly for electrification, for example.
Yes.
That is much more generous in other countries than it perhaps is in the UK, apart from some specific industries. I mean, what we look at is, if you have a look from a decarbonisation perspective, for example, 50% of emissions from industry comes from outside the major hydrogen clusters, which have been the focus of much government effort over the last sort of 5 years or so. So 50% of emissions at the minute have no support from government in terms of how they're going to electrify, how they might use biomethane or other kind of on-site solutions to decarbonise. And what we hope is that the budget will come through with kind of a better way in which it can enable industry to look at electrification, to get assets, on site, so that they can start to maximise some of their on-site electric consumption, as well as starting to play in flexibility markets. So, if we were going to do anything in terms of explicit government support, as kind of we get the changes we need to markets, that is the thing that needs to happen this year.
Do you have an expectation that it will happen?
I'm not writing it off. It's
right.
A difficult budget, as we all know.
Yes, of course, yeah.
But on the other hand, we are in a situation where, from an economic growth perspective, industrial productivity is really important. I mean, one of the really defining challenges for the UK is, how do you build a really strong economic base in this country that is based on decarbonisation?
Yes.
And we are going to have to square that circle at some point, right?
Clean Power 2030 kind of mandates that, right, in many respects?
Well, it's interesting, Clean Power by 2030, I think, in terms of... if we want to go through it. But if I'm honest, Clean Power by 20, all of the decisions that have been made on Clean Power by 2030 at the minute will put up bills for industrial sites, right, as it stands right now. There is nothing in that, as it stands, that will lower bills. So the changes that we're talking about in terms of support for electrification, support for broader decarbonisation, a real focus on demand for connections and productivity, and the ability to play in markets properly to earn money from what you're doing with your energy, is now a really, really important part of making Clean Power by 2030 actually work for industrial productivity.
Yeah. I guess this is the thing, I keep on coming back to it, but there's this expectation or this ambition, I suppose, and then there's the market reality that obviously a lot of customers you work with, James, will face, and it's what can be done in the meantime while these changes actually are cemented, I suppose. I mean, this is where a company like Aggreko really comes into its own, really, isn't it? I suppose, giving people the opportunity, either to become more efficient or be able to participate while government catches up.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps historically Aggreko would be a company that provided a temporary power solution for companies. That's changing now, especially with the renewables revolution. We now have that capability to provide not only those short-term interim solutions, but the long-term solution as well. And I think that's where we're going with the business, as we see the demand from our customers, quite frankly. We're ensuring that we can provide temporary power if that's all they need. But if they're looking for that long-term solution, like a solar park adjacent to their factory or what have you, then that's something that we can potentially support them on. So.
Yeah. Okay, Caroline, what about you? What does flexibility look like as we move towards 2030 and beyond?
So I'm really excited. We're still in a situation where the system is all messed up and markets are screwed up and they're not quite as they should be. But I really feel like the fundamentals are there. Right, we are moving to a system that needs flexibility for it to work, and so we're going to have to find a way through. And I think when we sort of start to think about, okay, what does 2030 look like? What does 2035 look like? What you're seeing is actually a situation where we have a system that will be kind of really flourishing, kind of good liquid markets for flexibility at both national and local level that are working well, and in a way in which, rather than putting industrial sites into this kind of big gas plant box that we have tried to put them into, actually it's going to be markets and data infrastructure that actually is it knows what industrial sites need and how they work. It knows that intimately in the way that it knows about gas plants now, and is using that to get to a situation where actually we're keeping the bills on for much lower costs than we would have done otherwise, and we get to a situation where we actually start to push forward on industrial productivity again.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to end. Just, I guess the phrase there, I don't want to borrow from another episode, but critical mass, I guess, we're approaching that point where I think the pieces are falling into place, aren't they? So, yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Curious to get both sides of the fence there in many respects. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Great.